My goal is to teach you guys basically like a dummy's guide to real estate development as best as I can today. And so what I've done is kind of written myself a little script here since I can't interact with you guys too much. And we're going to frame this discussion basically as if you guys were going to develop the Crossways Farm Village project somewhere in Texas. So we're using the Crossways philosophy when it comes to land design and coding and things of that nature, but we're going to use Texas land development processes. And so since you got my bio and heard about me, nobody cares about that, we're done. The last thing I want to say before we get going is, I'm very, personally, like I said, I'm envious of all you guys that are coming to the industry with a design skill set. There's really nothing more dangerous in the development industry than a designer that knows finance, that knows project management, that knows how to lead teams in the field, that can develop. That is how the world got Dr. Mulder in the first place, and that's why I get to work on a project like Crossways. So I'm excited for you guys. So Mark, if you can move to the next slide, please. All right. Okay. So I gave myself 2 freebies before we get into the nuts and bolts of development. I've got to get on my soapbox really quick. So, I really believe in what I do. I hope that comes through in this presentation. I know that all of you guys are developing your own personal philosophies. I'm sure some of y'all are very set in those philosophies today. I'm glad you should be. Burn bright and don't take any prisoners. I think that's important to think about. This is just a sample of mine. First things first, the CAD files that you guys are working on, that's eventually going to be the streets that barefoot kids ride bikes on, where parks roll out their picnic blankets and fall in love. It's places where the couples that are already in love are going to grow old together. You've got to design the places that you want to raise your kids in. It's never just a job. Second, you need to know what your task is. You guys are cultivating a sense of community, just like farmers cultivate the earth. Reflect often on what the components of a healthy community are and deliver on them. And really, when I think about this and I think about community, I think about balance. If you study Eastern religion, especially, there's a lot of talk about harmony. There's a lot of talk about balance. When it comes to community, you've got to think about giving people nutrition, exercise, romance, jobs, excitement, the ability to work hard. All of those things need to be components in the community. They need to be locally available, and they need to be available to everybody. It needs to be universal. Moving forward from there, what makes a great designer and developer? For both of them, it's learning and honoring human traditions and improving on them where needed. Most developers don't do this. I'll be honest with you. Having worked in the industry just a few years, I can tell you, I've had to compromise a lot more than I would like, and I have seen a lot of guys that are certainly chasing the dollar, guys and girls that are chasing the dollar. It's okay. Everybody's got to make a living, but at the end of the day, we all want to leave a legacy as well. So, when it comes to learning from the past, look at what those people who have gone before you have done. Examine things that have worked and the things that haven't, and never be afraid to question the status quo and what's being done now, and innovate. And finally, you need to recognize, well, not really finally, but you need to recognize that your team is your tribe. You've got to earn your place at that table every day, showing up sharp, showing up prepared, and showing up in good humor so that you can lead your team, whether you're on the design side, developer side, construction, whatever. It's your responsibility to earn your place every single day. And then finally, I've got this note about taking ownership. There's one thing that I see in the development industry. Development by nature is a multifaceted industry. You've got a million different people working on the same project. And so it's very easy to point fingers. It's very easy for nobody to step in and say, hey, this was my fault that things didn't work out. And so what I want to leave with you guys is that, if your project fails, it is your fault. It definitely is. But it's also everybody else's fault. And so if you don't take ownership of the projects that you work on, the world is just going to have a lot of mediocre places. And so take ownership, take pride, think about the fact that this is your land and you want to do something cool with it. Mark, I'll take me to the next slide, please. There you go. Okay, so again, getting off my soapbox a little bit. This slide is really, my idea here is really just to give you guys some homework up front, give you guys something to work with throughout this pandemic while you guys are isolating. Rather than going through and describing each of these books, I just want to start with a fun anecdote. Sue Moore was my Meemaw, my mom's mom. I'm in her house right now, sitting at her dinner table. Every time I went and visited my grandmother as a kid, I would get a new book that had a note written inside the cover. It'd be something like, Robert Michael, Captain Augustus McCrae is one of Texas's greatest cowboys. I hope you enjoy reading about his adventures on the way to Montana as much as I did. Don't worry about the hooers, which is Lonesome Dove, by the way. Love Meemaw. Every time I got one of those notes from my grandmother, I knew that I was going to get a phone call about a month later. And my grandmother would call me and ask about some detail in the book, like, what I thought about Captain McCrae waking up before the cattlemen every day in chapter 5. What did that mean, right? And God forbid I didn't have an opinion on that. There's nothing in the world that feels worse than disappointing your grandma. And so, my grandmother really brainwashed me into being a good and a careful reader when I was a kid. It's the coolest trick in the world looking back on it and thinking about raising kids of my own. But the reason I'm telling y'all this story is that, what that did for me is that made me take reading seriously. And that has been, I would say, easily, that is the number one skill in my toolbox. It's really the reason why I had the opportunity to do what I'm doing right now, why I'm going to be moving to South Africa soon. And as you guys go through these books, you guys are, you're all going to have to find your own personal optimal way to absorb information. But you need to find that and you need to start using it. I'll tell you what I do. I skim the chapter. When I start a book, I'll take the chapter and I'll skim all of the headlines and I'll try and understand what the structure of the author's argument is. As I read through the chapter, I'll read through in one go and I'll highlight important points. And then I get in an app called Evernote, which some of you guys may know, and I jot down those points or anywhere that gave me a flash of inspiration. So that's not the right process for everybody, but certainly you need to figure out what's the best way for you to remember information and retain it. So I hope you guys enjoy these books. And Mark, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So now I'm truly off my soapbox, and we're going to start the discussion in earnest and get into the nuts and bolts here. So what I've done here is I've laid out 11 stages of a typical land development project. And this is soup to nuts. I did my best to be comprehensive and give you absolutely everything that you need to worry about. The truth is that land development is obviously a very complex process and every project's different. So just think about this as a framework and understand that you may have to add and subtract items to it as you go, but this is pretty comprehensive. And also another note, I've laid this out chronologically, but land development is not a purely linear process. It's a lot like design in the sense that what you're doing as a land developer is you are constantly gathering data, you're making assumptions, you're forming hypotheses, you're testing those hypotheses, and then you're making adjustments as you go. And as you get better information, as you work through this process, you go back and you revisit the previous stages and you tighten up your development program as much as you can. So really all these stages loop back into each other. And you guys are going to see that as we talk about each slide. It's, some of this stuff a lot of this is just happening simultaneously. So this is the 30,000 foot view. And since all you guys are in the environmental design class and have that design background, I want to drive home the point that even though stage 6 is design and placemaking, designers do not enter and leave a project in stage 6, and it's the land developer, throughout the rest of the process. good land developers, all land developers, rely on their designers from the very beginning of a deal all the way until the end. And so from here on out, for the rest of these slides, as we run through these stages, what we're going to do is what we talked about earlier. We're going to use Crossways Farm Village as our case study. We're going to assume that we're building it, say, in Bryan, Texas, and we're gonna go on from there. So, Mark, ready for the next slide? Okay. Deal inception. Okay, so stage one of land development is pretty obvious, deal inception. If you don't have a project, you don't have any way of making a return, right? You got to have something to work on. And so, so in terms of Crossways, basically, let's just assume that we're all young land developers, and we just found a 520 hectare site, which is about 1,285 acres. Puttergill's Dairy Farm only actively grazes cattle on about a third of that land. The rest of that land is too rocky, it's too wet, steep, maybe it's too pretty, it's a wildflower preserve, so they don't want to run their Holstein cattle on it. It's not useful to them. But they recognize that they can make money off of that non-prime farmland. And so you're a young mixed-use developer, you've got grand ambitions. What are you going to do first? To start the process, your goal is to get to a signed letter of intent with the Puttergills. So LOIs, also known as term sheets, are basically just shortened legal agreements. They don't carry the same legal weight as a purchase agreement. They're like one step above spitting in your hand and shaking. They're used to ensure both parties are serious about a shared endeavor. And so it gives both parties a sense of comfort and trust that the other party's going to perform. So once you've signed a letter of intent and you've negotiated the general terms of the deal, you've identified the property, the parties that are involved, how long you have to study the property before you have to purchase it, which we call the due diligence period. We're going to talk about in more detail. Once you've got those general terms laid down, what you did is you found a site that was looking for a use. You know, Puttergill had the site, you had the use, actually a mix of uses, and you put those things together. Another way to look at it, a use looking for a site, as an example, if you were, say, the Whataburger land acquisition manager, you've got a use and you're looking for sites all over Texas. And so you're trying to fit your box into those pieces of land. So it's just two different angles trying to get to the same goal. It really doesn't change things. It's just a theoretic framework there. So a couple other things I want to leave you with on this first stage. You know, this is where you set the very basic DNA of any project that you are working on. And you need to remember that some land development projects can last 20 plus years. You know, the Veramendi community in New Braunfels, I've got another buddy who's an MLPD grad as well, developing that project. He's going to do that project for the rest of his life. And so you need to choose your partners wisely. You need to know the people that you're doing business with. If you guys don't share vision and commitment, if they're not of solid character, if you can't trust them, those flaws are going to come back and they're going to be fatal. Because character flaws are, you know, flaws that you really can't train out, you can't teach out, you usually can't get around them. And so you're going to end up, you know, circling back and having to restart, or the deal's just going to get shuttered. So that's the absolutely essential part of starting out. And the last thing I would say is that 90% of the projects that you guys might see out there are probably bad projects. There's a lot of people that are land developers that want to be good land developers and honestly just don't know what they're doing, or they fall in love with a project to the point that they, you know, they lose sight of reality and what the market will bear. And you know, a lot of people are guilty of that. I've been guilty of that in the past. Especially because I tend to be a little bit more idealistic. So be careful about folks like that and shield yourself. We're going to talk about risk mitigation as we go. Ready for the next slide, please. Okay, so stage two, we've agreed on the general terms of the deal. That LOI has been executed. So now it's going to start getting complicated, guys. So this is a good chance to listen carefully here, a good opportunity to listen carefully. So here's the general structure of the deal. We've set the LOI up so that you're going to bring in a wealthy equity investor, who we're going to call money bags. So you can probably remember that. And Moneybags is going to provide 5% of the capital that's needed to secure a development loan. That development loan is going to be necessary to obtain the construction costs that we need. So Moneybags gives up 5%. You're going to contribute 5% equity. And then the Puttergills have agreed to commit that third of their land where the project's going to sit as security against that development loan. And the bank is going to value that land. And after they've done the appraisal, let's just say that the land is worth 15%. So 15 plus 5 plus 5, 25% equity that's ready to go into this project, 25% of what you think the overall cost will be. So what you need to do is you need to secure all of these positions, and you need to establish legal control of the site, because if you don't have legal control, somebody can steal it right from underneath you and you're going to lose all your money. Not fun. So first, you and Moneybags are each going to create legal entities to ensure that your personal belongings, like your car, your house, your dog, your firstborn child, aren't going to be taken by the bank if you go belly up. Let's just say that in Texas, that you both decided to form your own LLCs, limited liability companies, because what that does is it gives you that liability shield where they don't come after your personal belongings if you go bankrupt, and you also don't get taxed twice at the personal level and as a member of a company. You only get taxed on a personal level. So there you go. You've got a liability shield set up. You and Moneybags do. And now the next step is that those LLCs can come together in a joint venture. And so what you're going to do to create that venture is sign a partnership agreement. And what this is basically you and Moneybags as legal entities agree to both contribute your 5% equity stakes. And you also agree on all the little nitty gritty things about how you're going to make decisions and how you're going to operate the company. So the partnership now that's been created, that's a new legal entity, and that is Crossways Ventures Pty Limited. That's the company that employs me currently. So like I said, this is all real stuff as much as I can make it without showing you too much of our cards. So Crossways Ventures, the partnership, now makes the LOI legally binding. And the way you do that is you enter into a purchase and sale agreement, which we call a PSA, with the Puttergills. You have a contract to purchase the property after a 180-day due diligence or option period. Just like if you guys were looking to buy your first house, you would make an offer on a home and they would give you maybe 30 days to get your home inspection done and check for termites. It's the same thing in land development, except that the timeline is a lot longer. And as you're going to see on the next slide, it's a heck of a lot more complicated. But once you've got that purchase and sale agreement signed, you've got legal control of the site, and you can start spending your equity money, but very cautiously, because you're still inspecting the deal. The last thing that you're going to do, your last goal, is executing professional service agreements with all your team members. This is where, as a land developer, I'm going to hire my civil engineer. I'm going to start hiring my architect, my landscape architect, my planners, whoever I'm going to work with, all my attorneys, things of that nature. These professional service agreements, which we don't call PSAs, by the way, in the industry, these professional service agreements are basically just the contract for you guys to provide services to the project. And sometimes I may offer you equity to come in and join the project if you're going to do a lot of work for it, or we may just agree upon a fee. So last thing, read every word of every contract that you sign. That's a good rule for life in general. But in land development, I can't tell you how many developers I've met that are in their, towards the middle or the end of their career that still skim contracts. I guarantee it will bite you in the ass. Guarantee it. All right, next slide, please. Step 3 or stage 3 is the due diligence and feasibility study. So this is there's a lot to say here. This is probably the most critical part of land development, because this is where you're going to make that final go, no-go decision to proceed. So coming back to our case study of Crossways, you've signed your purchase and sale agreement, and in that contract, it's got a 180-day due diligence period, maybe some extensions in case you need more time that you can purchase. So in that time, you need to identify all of the potential risks in the deal as far as you can, and you need to mitigate them. Mitigate risk. Developers don't avoid risk. If you want to avoid risk, just go and put your money in government bonds or maybe some fairly state safe blue chip stocks. Right? Developers are after an outsized return and an outsized impact on the world, and it takes risk in order to make that happen. And we'll talk about risk adjusted returns later on. But your goal is to know the risks and take action to lessen the chance that they're going to hit you. So in the MLPD program at A&M, we are taught 6 areas of due diligence. Some of y'all may know Dr. Kent Anderson. He's really the guru behind this. But just real briefly, because we're going to talk about most of these stages as we go, legal and entitlement due diligence focuses first on ensuring that those underlying contracts are going to enable you to achieve your goals, and your contract attorney is really the one that's going to guide that decision. The second part, entitlement, which we're going to talk about in detail next, focuses on obtaining zoning approvals and other municipal approvals so that you can build what you want to build. The city or the municipality will support you. Financial due diligence is fairly obvious probably, but it progresses through stages from back of the napkin models to discounted cash flow and all kinds of things. And basically, as you move through your financial due diligence, what you're trying to do is at the outset, you give yourself a little bit of buffer. You set some fat, which we call contingency. And as you learn more about the project and the costs involved, you start decreasing that contingency buffer so that your overall budget gets a little bit leaner and you don't have to take out as much cash. But this is basically setting you up to go get that loan and make sure that your project's going to perform. Locational and market due diligence is all about studying, macroeconomic and microeconomic trends, the national market, the local market, understanding where interest rates are and how that affects you. Where are we at in the market cycle? Things of that nature. It also includes a very critical goal, which is identifying who your target market segment is. Target market segment. And basically what that is just who's your buyer, what will he or she pay, and what are their other alternatives. If they want a community that's kind of in a rural setting like Crossways is and offers, an agricultural experience, there's probably not too many projects that are out there that are like that. You've got a pretty unique offering. But if you're building another residential master plan community, well, God knows there's 10 of those in every quadrant of San Antonio. I worked on a bunch of them. So you've got to think about who's your buyer and how do you differentiate yourself. Environmental due diligence involves analyzing the site for existing environmental issues that need to be mitigated, or maybe you do need to drop the project because of them. These get very tricky. What you don't want to do is take control of a site that has a serious environmental issue, because it will bankrupt you before you ever start turning dirt. And the way that we do that is a phase 1 environmental site assessment. We just basically go walk the site. You have an environmental engineer typically that will walk the site and try and identify any issues out there. Another thing that this stage involves is IDing the impact that you are going to make on the natural world. So if you are cutting down all the trees on the site and you just eliminated all of the breeding habitat for the golden cheek warbler, which is actually an endangered bird in San Antonio, you're in trouble. And you need to quantify what those impacts could be so that you can mitigate them later on in your design process. I'm sure you guys know a lot about that. Physical due diligence ensures the site is cost effective to develop your particular vision. So you're thinking about the topography, you're thinking about the geotechnical quality of the soils, you're thinking about the water table, you're taking a step back and figuring out what your marketing window is. So basically, how are buyers going to approach your site physically? And can they see it? Can they see what you're doing over there? There's all kinds of aspects to physical due diligence, obviously, but this is making sure that you can you can build what you want to build in a cost-effective manner. Social due diligence ensures that your vision is compatible with the surrounding environment. At the end of the day, are your neighbors going to be happy or pissed off when you come into their neighborhood? Are they going to support you, or are they going to pick at you when you go to city council for rezoning? And also, what good can you do out there? What does the community need? Do they need a new elementary school in that area? If they do, that's a great way, it's a great component to bring into your project. And so you want to identify those things. So, like I said, I know this is a really long one. I apologize. That was the one that I couldn't cut down much, but this is probably the most critical part of development. Risk mitigation is the name of the game. Once you have satisfied your concerns within your risk appetite, you're comfortable moving forward. You can make that decision. Or maybe you just terminate your contract and go find a different project, right? Next slide, please. Okay, entitlement. So keep in mind that the next couple of stages here probably take place during your due diligence period. That due diligence period's got a clock on it, right? 180 days. And so the longer that you take, the better the chances that it expires and you have to buy the property, and then you're in it to win it. So just assume that right now we're lucky and we're moving quick and we're able to stay within our due diligence period. So stage 4, most municipalities use some form of Euclidean single-use zoning, especially here in the United States. And if they don't, they use some sort of form-based code, which has been, that's really kind of a new, form-based coding is really a new development, but, it's been done naturally just, for thousands of years. It's just now that we've started to really codify it and identify it. We'll talk about that later on in design. But either way, whatever framework you're working within, you're always going to have to obtain approval from the local municipal authority to execute your planned use. And so if Crosswaves was built there in Bryan, Texas, you'd be converting land that's probably zoned for agriculture because it's the Putter Gills Dairy Farm, into a higher intensity mixed use designation. So you're moving it from agriculture to mixed use. That's a huge step up in terms of intensity of development. And so that's already going to raise some concerns with the locals. And just note that if you find land that's already zoned for your use, if you had gone and bought a mixed use parcel, you get to skip this step entirely and build by right. That's always a good idea when it makes sense for the project. So assuming we're in Texas, and, instead of Bryan, we'll just use the city of Couga because Crossways is in the Couga municipality in South Africa, right? So the city of Couga first says, well, you got to go present your project to our planning and zoning committee. That's a bunch of urban planners and other design gurus that basically analyze the development code and either agree or disagree with projects that go on. So you had already approached the local neighborhood association and you'd already approached your local city council person because you're smart. And since they are, generally in agreement, and that maybe you've traded horses a little bit and agreed to do certain things or adjust your plan certain ways, they generally agree. And so planning and zoning says, okay, you're basically operating within our unified development code. We clear you and approve this project. You can go to city council. So the next month, you schedule an appearance in front of the Couga City Council. City Council takes issue with the idea of developing buildings on pristine farmland, this beautiful dairy farm that's out in the country, right? But you impress them with your vision of new ruralism, because new ruralism is obviously light on the land. It's meant to vitalize rural areas, invigorate them. It's not meant to turn them into strip malls and Walmarts and McDonald's, right? And so since you've impressed them with this idea of new ruralism, they agree tentatively to rezone as long as you enter into an agreement with the city to provide a fund for the impoverished Thornhill neighborhood, which actually Thornhill is actually a township right next to Crossways, and we do have a trust fund for them. And so, this is just called the development agreement. And, what you have to realize about this is that anytime you go and ask the city for anything, for example, ask them to change their zoning code, you open yourself up to negotiation, and they can negotiate on anything. So, whatever it may be, chances are you're going to end up getting into a discussion with the city. That's going to take up a lot of time, and ultimately you're going to have to trade horses a little bit to get your zoning. But once you get your zoning, once city council approves, you're able to go in and build what you want to build by right. You've got the legal right to build it. And so you're vested in the property. And that's a really critical concept to grasp as well, vesting in rights. So this also really lets you, once you skip this hurdle, because it's the number one risk in development, because it's just politics, you really can get comfortable with spending equity dollars and move forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. All right, so moving on into finance, stage 5. I hope you guys are still with me here. I know I'm talking at you. It's kind of an interesting format. I'm trying to make it interesting here. Finance is difficult too. Uh, Thankfully, at this stage, we're still in due diligence, right? So we have not actually purchased the dairy farm land yet. We're still in that 180-day period, but we're starting to sweat a little bit. In order to build Crossways Farm Village, we need a pretty substantial acquisition and development loan that's going to provide 75% of the total development cost. So just to review from back when we were talking about the LOI, remember, you and your partners and the putter gills through their land put up 25% of the overall cost. Well, somebody's got to come up with the rest of that money. And so what you've done is you approach Texas Capital Bank, and you had your designers whip up some really nice renderings and an awesome land plan with all kinds of great graphics, and you've turned that into a business plan, and that business plan lays out the nuts and bolts of how you think the project's going to perform, and look at all these cool things that we're going to build. Bank, you need to get in while the getting's good, right? But the bank is a bank. They are finance guys. They like to play golf on Sundays and crush natty lights and stuff like that, right? That's who those guys are. So they don't believe in your vision. They don't care. They want proof that the project's going to pencil and make them some money. So you had previously, just run the numbers on a bar napkin while sipping bourbon with money bags, your investor. And by the end of the night, you both agreed that you'd be millionaires in no time. So now that the bank's pushing back, you really start to sweat, right? That back of the napkin analysis maybe didn't have enough detail. So what you do is you have that initial conversation with the bank, and then you go and you complete a discounted cash flow model. And what that is basically just an Excel model, and you are trying to project every dollar that's going to be spent throughout the life of the project, and every dollar that's going to come back and be earned throughout the life of that loan. So dollars in and dollars out. Dollars in are your lot sales, your home sales, your leasing income, whatever it may be. Dollars out are hard costs of construction and engineering, soft costs of your design fees, your administration, and then also your interest, right? Your debt coverage. And so when you take that income, you subtract out all those costs, what you're left with is basically every month you've got a negative or a positive cash flow depending on how much money you spent that month. And when you analyze that series of cash flows throughout the life of a project, you come up with a number of metrics, and probably the most the most used, most familiar, most useful one is, you see on my slide, the IRR. That's the internal rate of return, and all that is the average annual return on your equity. So it's a tool to compare projects. There's no number that's good or bad, though a zero or a negative is definitely bad because you're not making any positive dollars on top of your money or getting your money back. But let's just say that the bank says, most of our development projects perform at like 13 or 14%. You're saying 16%, and I like your assumptions in your model. We're going to go with it, right? That's an appropriate return considering this is a very forward-looking project and a very high level of risk. So you submit your development budget to the bank. They take a look at it, and they send you a loan agreement, which you sign. And once you've done that, once you have that loan agreement, what you've done is you now have completed what's called your capital stack. So you've got your equity dollars. If you needed to bring in mezzanine debt, which is kind of like a middleman that fills out however much debt the bank won't give you, you got that. And then your senior debt is the majority of the debt that you are actually, it's the development loan you're actually carrying throughout the life of the project that you are going to pay back after the project's complete. It's usually an interest-only loan. So as you build something, you are basically paying back the principal after completion of the project. You're only paying interest during construction. And that's a key point too. What it means is that, you're not paying down your loan for maybe 2 years, 5 years, whatever. It's not going to be 5 years, but hopefully. Um, what that means is that when construction's over, you need to pay back the loan quickly. So that's finance. On to the next slide, please.